the second on cultural geography, and then the final one on geopolitics, which is extremely important right now at the time of this recording in November of 2024. So this is North Africa and Southwest Asia. Oftentimes you'll hear about it being called the Middle East. But that's a Eurocentric term based on direction from Europe. So the Far East would be places like India and China, and the Middle East was this region. But again, it doesn't make much sense. So as geographers based on continental plates, etc., we call it North Africa and Southwest Asia. And this goes all the way from the Atlantic Ocean, from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, then moving into like Libya, Egypt, parts of Sudan, the Arabian Peninsula with multiple nations, especially the Persian Gulf oil states, as well as places like Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. So it really stretches a very broad area with a lot of different groups of people. The first thing that you want to notice about this one is climate. It's very notable for being one of the driest regions in the world. We have the Great Sahara Desert, of course, in North Africa. The Arabian Peninsula is mostly desert, and we also have areas in the middle of like Iran that are very much desert. You have some steppe climates, but the other pronounced one is the Mediterranean climates, which are in green on this slide. And so Mediterranean climates are obviously in the Mediterranean, and it's very similar to what we have here in California, where you have relatively dry summers that are warm, and then you have mild winters with most of the rainfall, which makes the Mediterranean climate very unique around the world. And we've talked about that previously in the course. And that relates to population. Most of the population is located along the coastlines in those Mediterranean climates. They're more conducive to agriculture and settlement as opposed to the desert regions. And then a big one you can see obviously is in Egypt along the Nile River. 95% of their population actually lives within 5 miles or 10 miles of the Nile River. You can also see some other higher ones in Yemen, down in the bottom part of the Arabian Peninsula. Maybe my cursor will help you see that. Up in those highlands where you get a little bit more moisture and are able to grow more crops. Now tectonically, we have 3 plates that are interacting here. We have the African plate that's running into the Eurasian plate, and the Arabian plate, which is running into the Eurasian plate. And that creates some of these tectonic boundaries that we're going to take a look at here in a moment. So because of these plates, you can notice that, and I'm going to start with the Red Sea, which is down there between the African plate and the Arabian plate. And what they're doing is they're actually drifting apart from each other. And that's created some volcanic activity and volcanic islands there, as well as earthquakes along that rift valley going down between the Arabian and African plate. You do have some volcanic activity there, as well as in places like Turkey. And a big thing that you do have is a lot of earthquakes because you're having these plates running into each other. So you see that subduction zone between the Arabian plate and the Eurasian plate, right? And the African plate and the Eurasian plate as well, with some fault lines going through places like Turkey as well as Iran. So you end up with a lot of mountain building, but also earthquake activity. And this shows on the left-hand side different types of earthquakes and volcanic activity. You can see it right along the same lines of those plate boundaries. Now that also creates a lot of mountainous areas, so we're going to talk about 5 of them. The Atlas Mountains, which are on the left-hand side of this screen in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. The Levant, which is basically in Israel, Palestine, parts of Lebanon and Syria. So that runs right down there, and they call that the Levant. The Elburz and Zagros mountain ranges are in Iran, along those plate boundaries. And very large mountains, some volcanic and a lot of earthquakes. The Taurus Mountains are in Turkey. And then in Yemen, which again is at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula, we have the Yemen Highlands. So let's look at those very briefly. Here's the Atlas Mountains. Again, going from Morocco into Algeria and Tunisia, right across that northern part of Africa. And if you look at the bottom right, this looks kind of a lot like Los Angeles. You have that Mediterranean climate along the coastline, and then you have these mountains right behind it. They do have these beautiful mountain villages, and you can actually go skiing. There's snow as well in North Africa. But beautiful rain-fed, valleys and villages for agriculture. The Levant, as I mentioned before, runs from starting in Syria, going through Lebanon and into Israel, form this mountainous background. They do have ski areas as well. I like kind of point that out in this region. And again, looks kind of similar to California in some ways. Going to Iran, we have the Elburz Mountains, which you see a stratovolcano right there on the left-hand side, and this kind of really rugged terrain. And then the Zagros Mountains with these beautiful alpine meadows, volcanic peaks, and a lot of snowpack. And again, that's right in the middle of Iran. And then down again in the southern part, my head's in front of it on this on this video, but the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, you have these terraces and more precipitation in the Yemen highlands, and so that allows for higher populations because of the agriculture. And then probably one of the most important physical aspects of this region is water. Um, there's a lot of issues with that because it's such a dry region. So the first two, we have the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And you can kind of see it on this map. They begin up in Turkey, up in the Taurus Mountains, and the Tigris then runs down through Iraq, out to the Persian Gulf. The Euphrates starts also in Turkey, but it runs through Syria and then into Iraq, and then makes its way out, joining the Tigris into the Persian Gulf. And the Tigris and Euphrates are very important rivers. This is the land that's called Mesopotamia. We'll talk a bit more about that with agriculture, but 10,000 years ago, this is the first place in the world where people domesticated plants and animals. And Mesopotamia means the land between rivers. And the two rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates, so very important rivers in this region. The Jordan River starts up in Syria and Lebanon and makes its way along the border between Israel and Jordan. And it's kind of it's an exotic river in that it doesn't go out to the ocean. It actually ends in the Dead Sea. But it's an important water source and a source of conflict amongst a lot of the nations in this region. And then, of course, we have the mighty Nile River that starts down in Eastern Africa up in the highlands and makes its way through the Sudan and then up through Egypt. And of course, another place where you have a history of domestication of agriculture and irrigation, and a very important river, of course, the longest river in the world. Now, just as a side note, I want to point out what's called the Qanat system. This is based in Iran, although you can see it also existing in other parts of this region, but Iran is kind of the main one, and it's over 2,700 years old. So basically in the highlands, you get a lot more snow melt and rainfall, and that water then seeps down and creates underground water sources. And so for the Qanat, they drill wells down from the highlands into that underground water source, and then they funnel it out to the lowlands, the drier regions in the lowlands, to cities, for example. So here's an example from a satellite image of the drills going down. And then the water comes out in fountains, in houses, and things like that in the lowlands, in the cities. And again, a really ancient form of irrigation as well as a water supply. The second thing, it makes natural air conditioning. So these are warm regions on the lowlands, very hot. And you can see that the wind on the top of this diagram, the wind direction's coming in, so it's really hot air. It gets sucked into these wind towers and pushed down into the basement. On the right-hand side, you can see the qanats, those wells, where the hot air is coming down, and it gets cooled by that water that's running underground, and it comes up. Whoops, I went one too fast. And it comes up into the basement of the house. And that causes convection and cooling. So the air is cooled by that water, and the hot air then is released out and ventilates out. So it's like a natural air conditioning system. Here's an example of those wind towers where that hot air comes in through the top, comes down into the basement, and the underground water is cooling the air and lifting it up and creating natural air conditioning. My dad was an air conditioning repairman, and so in New Mexico, and so we actually use these similar techniques. So I kind of get a kick out of it. All right, just going to continue on. It's only been 10 minutes. We'll just move into population geography now and some of the cultural aspects and see how long we go. And you guys always can, stop anytime and pause and rewatch. So in terms of population geography, we talked a bit about this really along the coastlines and the waterways, as well as some of the highlands. That's because much of the area is very dry and desert-like. So there's over 500 million people, and it is growing. We'll see from different places. And again, clustered, as I mentioned, on the coast, rivers, as well as many of the highlands. And another thing to note is the physiological densities are some of the highest on Earth. And by physiological, you remember there's three different types of densities. Arithmetic density is the number of people per square mile or kilometer. Physiological density is how many people do you have per unit of land that you can farm. So how many people per unit of arable land? Because not all land is the same. And so you have a lot of the Sahara Desert, which you can't grow any crops on. And so that creates high physiological densities in this region. One example would be Egypt. And on the left here, this is the persons per square kilometer, and you can see how dense it is in the delta of the Nile River and along the Nile River. But outside, not that high. And on the bottom, it talks about arithmetic density, and you can see that. You look down, Egypt doesn't look too bad on arithmetic density. But if you look at the physiological density and percent arable, it's extremely high because most of that land in Egypt is not a place that you can grow crops on because it's mostly desert. So you see that on the right-hand side is a physical map of Egypt, and you can see the vegetation all along the Nile where people live. So here's some population pyramids. We'll start with Iraq, and you can see that they were growing very rapidly until recently. Just in the last 10, 15 years, you can see it's starting to flatten off, which means it was growing fast when you see it looking like a pyramid. But when those bottom tiers start to flatten out, that means they're having fewer and fewer children. So while it's still growing, it's going to be slower going into the future. The Gaza Strip, which is really important right now, and this will probably be altered by the conflict that's going on, that we'll talk later in the course about. But you can see it was a very fast growing region, but in the last 20, 30 years, you can see it really starting to slow down and flatten out again. So this is indicative of a slowing population growth. Still growing, but slower. Israel is really, a lot of their population growth is through migration of people moving into Israel. So it's growing naturally just a small bit, but it's mostly immigration that's adding into the population growth. But it is slowing down too. And here's an interesting one. This is Bahrain. This is in the Persian Gulf. It's a very oil wealthy region, and in 1995 you can see there's some kind of awkward things with this population pyramid, and you can see that working age groups of both males and females, but especially males, is kind of extended. And this is because of the oil wealth and construction industries and domestic ones with lots of in-migration for those industries. But that's 1995. Here it is in 2019, and you can see it's extremely, very skewed for that working one as their oil industry and construction has grown up. So natural population isn't growing, it's mostly immigration. And that happens to a lot of the Persian Gulf countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Oman, etc. So that relates to that idea of migration. So the big poles are oil jobs and then also Israel for a lot of the Jewish populations around the world, and also a growing economy. But the oil jobs are definitely bringing people to like Saudi Arabia, I mentioned Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, etc. The pushes for making people leave places is in some places, but they don't have oil wealth, there's not that many jobs. So a lot of those people are moving to the areas that there are jobs, especially in the petroleum industry. And then also conflict. If we think about Iraq, Afghanistan, which is technically not part of our region, but Syria, and right now we're thinking about what's happening in the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Lebanon, and the Sudan. So you see a lot of migration into those wealthier countries. And in terms of international immigration outside of this region, we see a lot of Lebanese that have been moved all around the world, from the Caribbean to Latin America to the US to Europe, etc., because of some of the conflicts and other things that have historically gone on in Lebanon and starting again right now. And then, of course, the Palestinians worldwide, starting all the way back in the 1940s to the present. And then, of course, a lot of migration to Europe from this region is close by. And Turkey is part of the European Union, so or I believe it is, so that is also a funnel that gets into Europe. And so you have a lot of migration into Europe because of that geographic proximity. And of course, to the United States. And one thing I think is very interesting, while the United States has the most amount of migrants, over 240 million migrants, or not, I'm sorry, 24 million migrants at least in the US, what you see as a percent of their population, it's really huge in the Persian Gulf. And again, that's because of that oil wealth. So you can see in Qatar, 87% of their population are migrants. The United Arab Emirates, it's 70%. Kuwait, 70%. For Jordan, it's about 46% of their population. That's mostly of refugees coming from places like Syria and Iraq. And then it kind of goes down, but you can see these large amounts. Israel receives lots of migrants. And again, really related to that oil wealth and the construction industries and oil. In terms of urban geography, we have some of the world's oldest urban areas. You can see places like Mesopotamia by 3500 BC had huge city-states. Egypt around the same time, creating some of the oldest urban areas. This is where agriculture was domesticated. And that led to the rise of things like trade centers as well. And these are 4 to 8,000 years ago. But then colonialism added a European influence, and this map right here shows a place called Fez in Morocco, and the French colonized it. On the right-hand side, you can see the old original city, very organic, developed over thousands of years, based on the terrain. The streets are kind of crooked and all over the place. They're very narrow, has a walled-in city for defense. So this is kind of the ancient type of city on the right that happened organically over thousands of years. On the left-hand side, you see the French city that they built right next to it, which is much more planned and orderly, and it's obviously much newer. And so that's kind of based on the French planning as they like to do it. You see a similar thing in other parts of the world, like in India, between Delhi and Old Delhi. So New Delhi was created by the British, Old Delhi was the original city. And so you can see those kind of juxtapositions between the two, the old and the new. Here's just a few examples. Places like Tehran in Iran, which is their capital city, over 8 million people, a major metropolis and modern city. And then you have these newer ones like Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, where they have these, just brand new because of all the oil wealth and construction and just making these amazing cities that are extremely modern, obviously. All right, let's jump into some cultural geography. I know I'm making this video a little bit longer, but you can always pause it. In terms of culture for religion, it's a very important place for religion. This is the hearth of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And this is kind of one of the first major religion areas where you have monotheism, which is the belief in just one deity, one God, if you will. Whereas animism often has multiple deities. This is more monotheism. So beyond the rise of Judaism, as well as then later Christianity, we also have the emergence of Islam, which is a very dominant religion in this region. It happened around 600 AD in modern day Saudi Arabia, so the Arabian Peninsula. The Quran is the book, similar to like in Christianity, we have the Bible, other ones have different ones. The Quran is the book of revelations that Muhammad received from God, which is Allah, around 610 AD, give or take. And then the term Islam actually means submission to the will of God. And here is kind of that relationship between these religions. So you can start off with God itself. You have Allah, Yahweh, or Jehovah, God, etc. You have Adam and Eve. And then at Abraham, it breaks apart. So Abraham had a wife named Sarah, but she couldn't have any kids. So he got a second wife named Hagar and had a son, Ishmael. And then that led to the Arab people, because eventually Sarah bore Isaac. And so Hagar left on one side, and that became the source of Arabic people. And on the left-hand side, through Sarah, you have Isaac, and that led to the Hebrew people, as well as then the break between Judaism and Christianity. So they all share a common ancestor, a common history. All three of these religious belief systems. We were not going to go too much into religion, but do want to kind of highlight the idea a little bit more about Islam. It diffused rapidly from 600 AD onward. So it started in the Arabian Peninsula, as you can see here, and then very rapidly went to Central Asia and North Africa, then spread through North Africa, even into Europe. More details on that in terms of the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal. For 700 years, the Moors were the dominant rulers of that entire part of Europe. Also spread through India, Central Asia, eventually through trade to places like Southeast Asia, as we mentioned in a previous course, places like Indonesia, and then across much of North Africa. So it diffused very rapidly through both things like conquest, but also through trade, as it's kind of a fulcrum point. If you look at this region, it's kind of the meeting ground between Africa, Asia, and Europe. And so lots of trade. So here's the 5 pillars of Islam. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail on religious aspects, but these are kind of the main 5 pillars for you guys to peruse. So again, that Muhammad is not a god, he is a prophet, and was a messenger from God. They have to pray 5 times a day in the direct direction toward Mecca, which is one of the sacred sites. You have to give charity and share with those that are less fortunate. And then Ramadan is a month where you don't eat or drink from dawn to dusk, if that's possible for you. And then the pilgrimage, the Hajj to Mecca. At least once in your life you're supposed to go if it's within your capacity. If you're too poor or you can't afford it or whatever it is, you don't have to do it, but you're supposed to have a pilgrimage to Mecca if you can. So today, when we think about religion in this region, first of all, Islam is the dominant one in this region. And you can see there's 2 groups, the Sunni and the Shiite. The Sufi are a smaller group, but the Sunni are the dominant, largest group of Muslims, 84%. We can think about like Saudi Arabia, much of the region. The Shiite are a smaller group, but they're dominant in places like Iran, also in Iraq, and then there are pockets all throughout this region. Christianity is a very small percent, about 3% of the region. And you have different groups, like the Maronite, these are old groups of Christianity, the Maronites as well as the Coptic Orthodox groups. And then Judaism is about 1%, focused mostly in Israel. And this is a map that shows this, and kind of an important distinction. You can see in Israel, right in the middle, that purple color, that's mostly Judaism. But if you take a look at all that orange color or yellowish orange, that's mostly Sunni. So you can see it really dominates the region, 84%. But then you have the Shiite that are really concentrated in Iran as well as in Iraq. There are pockets throughout. You can see in the Yemen highlands as well some Shiite dominance, but those are the main ones in Iraq and Iran. And that creates a bit of a divide in this Islamic world between the Sunnis and Shiites. Saudi Arabia and Iran are big regional, rivals in many ways, whether it's, political, religious, as well as military. So it's really important kind of a distinction between those groups. Now, in terms of language, relatively simple. The main ones are the Afro-Asiatic language family, and the two dominant ones are Arabic and Hebrew. So most of the Sunni world speaks Arabic, and then of course in Israel they speak Hebrew, but those are the dominant ones. We also have the Altaic family, which is mostly related more to Central Asia, but that's in Turkey and Turkic. And then the Indo-European language family is the largest one in the world. That includes most of the European languages, English, etc. But that includes Persian, which is often called Farsi. That's based in Iran. And we also have Kurdish languages, which is in northern Iraq, parts of Iran, and Turkey, which is a different group that we'll talk a little bit about later. But notice that when we think about Iran versus the rest, Iran is mostly Shiite religion, as well as a different language family. So they're very unique and different than the rest of the Arabic world that speaks mostly Arab, as well as following Sunni Islam. So let's move on to agriculture. And I mentioned this previously before. This is the Fertile Crescent from the Nile River going all the way up through Mesopotamia. And again, Mesopotamia is the land between rivers, between the Tigris and Euphrates. And this is about 10,000 years ago. We had the first agricultural revolution where people domesticated crops and animals, and is the origin of all of these different things from wheat to barley, cattle, sheep, goats, etc., and the beginning of irrigation. We also see a lot of oasis and riverine farming. So in the desert areas, you'll have underground water sources from aquifers that you can bring up. And so you'll have these oases in the middle of the desert where you can grow some crops. And then you also have river farming along the Tigris, Euphrates, Nile River, the Jordan, etc., where you can irrigate. And then along the coastal regions, you have a much more Mediterranean farming. And that's like we have in California. So think about olives, grapes, irrigated things for vegetables, etc. And then in the arid areas within the desert, you have pastoral nomadism. And that means it's more herding of livestock. So it can be camels, goats, sheep, etc. In much of the arid places where you can't grow crops because you don't have enough water, you can graze cattle. This is a map that shows the hearths, the origins of different types of crops. And you can see here in Southwest Asia, they have things like barley, wheat, lentils, oats, rye, beans, olives, grapes, etc. So this is one of the original hearths of agriculture. And then again, for domestication of animals, from pigs and ducks and sheep and goats, again, and cattle. Another important thing was irrigation. This is a picture I took in Oxford of the Scorpion King from over 5000 BC. So we're talking 7,000 years ago. And you can see on the top right next to his head is a little scorpion, which is why they call him the Scorpion King. But on the left side, you can see a straight angle coming down. And here he has a pick, which means that they're creating irrigation channels. And then that led to things like plows and carts in Mesopotamia and Egypt. So you start using domesticated cattle to carry things and as things. And of course, the great effects of this first agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago was the most significant cultural modification of nature. Hunters and gatherers obviously impacted the environment, but this was a really significant modification, making cities. So once you were able to domesticate things, you could have permanent settlements. You didn't have to move around. That created increases in population and then also allows people to specialize and do different things. So since you can make a surplus of crops, not everyone has to be a farmer. Now you can be a a metal worker or a woodworker or a builder or doing things like trade. So it created a lot of specialization in trade and different opportunities since you could have a surplus of crops to feed yourselves. Now today, agriculture, we have Mediterranean, dry farming in that Mediterranean climates along the coastlines. And then pastoral nomadism is in the kind of the light yellow in the very dry areas. And then you have oasis agriculture as well as irrigated agriculture along rivers. And you can notice that along the Tigris, Euphrates, as well as like the Nile River. Here's an example of an oasis along a river where you actually have some water. So it's dry desert outside, but you can actually irrigate in the middle and grow crops. And here's an interesting thing in Saudi Arabia. They have underground aquifers. This is water that's been accumulated over, 20, 30,000 years of accumulation of water that is underground. So you can see in 1991, they start irrigating that. So they start drawing on it, and you can see these are like little circles, and that's the center pivot irrigation that we have here, even here in the US. So you can see that in this part of the desert, they're starting to irrigate. That's those green areas. Here it is by 2000, and you can see these plots that are coming up where they're drawing off that aquifer water to grow crops. And here's by 2004, you can see it increasing. And if you jump on Google Earth and go there, you can see this exploding across Saudi Arabia. So they're using up this aquifer water. Unfortunately, once you use it up, it's gone, and it's going to take thousands of years for it to replenish. So they're using it now. We'll see how long that can last. But that also leads to some environmental issues. And the main ones that we see here is deforestation. Forest areas, there's not a lot of forest area, and much of it has, been lost historically. But the big thing that you have is things like desertification, some coastal pollution, but especially salinization. Salinization is the increase in salinity, the salt content in soils. So if you're in a dry region, it could be the Central Valley of California, but especially in these areas where it's very dry, and if you irrigate, a lot of that water will evaporate. And all water contains minerals and salts. So over time, those salts accumulate in the soils as water evaporates. And at some point, it gets so salty that plants can't uptake water. And so you can't grow crops on them anymore. And that's salinization. And you can see all the red circles are areas where they suffer from salinization. And it brought down empires in the past. Even in Mesopotamia, the Sumerian civilization fell because of salinization. And if you're here in California, you can see that in the Central Valley. If you're driving through, you see these white soils. That's salinated soils, and it's very difficult to recover. So in terms of development, taking a look at this is the Human Development Index, and there's a broad range here. So this is from 2021. You can see the US becoming at 21st, Israel's at 22nd, and you can see some of these oil-rich countries, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, all of those have relatively high Human Development Index scores in terms of development, and it's really related to their high gross national incomes per capita. But you do also have the ones that do not have oil. So we go down, and Algeria has some, and Egypt some, but you can see from Jordan, Libya, they have oil as well, but those human development indexes are much lower. And some of the lowest ones are places like Syria, which has been through so much conflict. If you look at their schooling scores are really low, the life expectancy. The Sudan as well is way down there, and Yemen is one of the poorest places on earth. And that relates obviously to who has resources. So the main oil states are in the Persian Gulf. That's Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Qatar. There's quite a few of them in the Persian Gulf. Libya and Algeria have some oil, but not that much. But places like the Sudan and Syria and them, they don't really. So you can see the oil states are really right there next to the Persian Gulf, and those are the wealthiest of these countries. Here's proven petroleum reserves, and you can see again Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, United Emirates, Qatar, etc. Have a really high percentage of the world's proven oil reserves. This is changing a bit, but this area still is kind of, reliant on petroleum or oil. And here's production of oil. I believe that the United States actually is the #1 producer now, but it's usually the top three is the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. And depending on the year, it goes between who's the leader, but those are the top three. And then natural gas as well. You can see this in places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Iran. We're looking at almost a third of the world's natural gas is located in this region. And then again, natural gas production, the US, I believe, is #1. Russia usually comes in second or first, but that's another resource that this region can increase because they have large reserves. And then another thing that it has is solar, right? There's a lot of sun in this region. And so here are different types of solar plants throughout the region, and the links to try to feed a lot of that into places like Europe. And then tourism is another major industry. Turkey is a very popular place for people from Europe to go. Great beaches and history and etc. Egypt obviously has things like the pyramids. And Saudi Arabia is a major one because of the Hajj. Mecca is in Saudi Arabia. So every year, millions of Muslims make the trek, the pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia. All right, we're going to stop here and we'll come back to geopolitics for the final one. It'll be a much shorter lecture. I know I went a little bit long on this one, so thank you.